I want to show you the method I've developed for cutting one of my favorite joints, which is not only super strong, but super efficient. That's a one-take Jake right there. The housed mortise and tenon. It's a joint that's been used for centuries, if not millennia. I don't know when the mortise and tenon was invented, but I assume it's been a long, long time. It is, without a doubt, an exceptionally strong joint. It has all of the strength of the dado, plus all of the strength of the mortise and tenon. What more could you want out of a joint? The problem with it, it just takes so bloody long to cut. It's an inefficient method to create a joint for casework, while a joint that's gonna last for millennia. It's not exactly a time-efficient method to create corner joinery or shelf joinery. And so I developed a method to create a housed mortise and tenon joint using floating tenons that I think is every bit as strong as a traditional joint and way more efficient. So let's talk about it. All right, let's start with a brief overview. What is a housed mortise and tenon? It is essentially a mortise and tenon in a dado. So it has all of the benefits of a dado and some of the benefits of a mortise and tenon, because in reality it's a short tenon, it's more of a stub tenon situation, so it has some of the benefits but not all of the benefits. Let's get that out of the way right off the jump. Now, as a reminder, let's ask the question, what is a dado, what is a mortise and tenon, and what's the difference? A dado is really nothing more than a shallow recess in a piece of wood. Now, this could be as little as 1/8 of an inch. Generally, it's not more than a 1/2 inch, but it's really dependent on the thickness of the piece of wood you're putting the dado in. And just as a point of clarification, a dado runs across the grain while a groove runs along the grain. So they're somewhat interchangeable, but they are different. Now, the positive section of the dado can sit right in that recess, and you have a super strong joint that is very, very strong in this orientation, but not so much in this orientation. If I try to do this on the bottom of a cabinet, that can just pull right out because there's not a lot of glue strength here. And as a side note, a dado can be the full width of a piece of wood. That's not a problem. I tend to put shoulders on my dados just so that I have a nice clean shoulder on my final piece. But that's me being bougie, I admit. So, dado, super, super strong for things like shelves, nearly indestructible in compression, but in tension, Then you have the mortise and tenon. Now, super traditional joint. This is essentially, if we can bastardize it to some extent, a variation on a dado. If I'm a gambling man, I imagine the dado came first and the mortise and tenon grew out of that, but I have no actual evidence of that. That's pure speculation in this moment from yours truly. But we have essentially this big, long, positive piece that goes into this deep negative piece. You have a ton of long grain to long grain glue contact on both sides. Super strong joint in tension and in compression and in racking. This joint is near bulletproof. It's probably the strongest joint in woodworking in the traditional sense, I would imagine. Again, pure speculation. However, in order to create a mortise and tenon, you need a big fat piece here, and you don't always have that. Sometimes you need to create a mortise and tenon going in this orientation into a skinnier dimension. And that's where the dado comes in. But, as we've already discussed, the dado is not super strong in tension. In compression, it's brilliant, it's wonderful, but in tension, So how do you remedy that situation when you need a dado, but it has to be strong in compression, say at the bottom of a cabinet to hold the bottom of said cabinet on? This is where the housed mortise and tenon comes in handy. If we go ahead and remove these right off the jump, you can see all we have is a standard dado. Super simple, super easy to cut. But if we add a couple of tenons in here, in this case floating tenons, then when we glue this up, we have substantially increased the glue surface along with the leverage of our male piece into our female piece, or our positive piece into our negative piece, and makes it way stronger in tension than a traditional dado. So why does this matter? When you're building cabinets, wall hanging cabinets, floor standing cabinets, sometimes the design calls for, or the client wants, the top and bottom to overhang the sides. The sides to be squeezed into that top and bottom, say like a Crenovian style cabinet. In order to accomplish that, you have to choose your joinery wisely, because if all you do is a dado, that cabinet bottom is going to fall off at some point in the future, and that doesn't make for a very happy client. So integrating something like a house mortise and tenon is going to make that joint way, way stronger, as well as make it last for the lifespan of the piece, however long that may be. So the next question is, how the hell do we cut the thing? So what I've done in years past, very, very simple method. I've used a straight edge with this router to cut my dado, and then I've reset the fence to align a domino to plunge my cuts. It's an effective method, it works, I've done it on dozens of cabinets. However, it does take an unfortunate amount of time, because when you go to line up your second cut, putting your dominoes in your dado, it's somewhat labor intensive to make sure that those dominoes are actually centered, and that's a really important aspect, because if they're not centered, and then on your positive piece they are centered, it ain't gonna fit, it's gonna be offset. So, how do you make sure that they stay centered? Now, those of you who have been watching me for a while likely know that I'm not a big fan of jigs. And I have nothing against jigs, I just don't find any joy in making them. And it's fine if you do, but I also don't particularly care for repetitive work. It's not a thing that excites me. So, I don't tend to do the same thing over and over. And when I do go to cut the same joint, I'm not doing 20, 30, 100 of that joint. I'm cutting 4, 8, something like that. But the professional in me that knows that time and efficiency are important and accuracy is important also knows that building a jig in order for me to make this particular joint more quickly and more accurately is just going to be a thing that's worth investing in. So I need to figure out a way to fabricate a jig that allows me to cut my dado and place my dominoes directly in the center of that dado without changing any settings. Alright, so what we've got so far is essentially just a traditional dado jig. I've got a substrate, in this case 1/4 inch MDF, that has a 90-degree fence on it, and once this glue dries I can take these clamps off and I'll be able to slide it on top of my workpiece and run my dado right along here, no problem. I know it's dead 90 degrees to my edge. Now we're going to cut a groove in this jig to give us access to actually cut our dado. And there's 2 ways that you can make sure your router stays centered in there. Number 1 is with a bushing. That's totally fine, that's pretty universal, you go ahead and do that. For me, I like to use a fence just because I don't know why I like to use a fence. I've never particularly cared for guide bushings, that's just a personal preference. And so what I'm gonna do is I'm going to figure out the distance from the center point of my bit to the edge of my router base, and I'm going to put a fence at that distance. dado is cut, everything looks good, everything is exactly where I wanted it to be. Now, on this particular router, the distance from the back edge to the center of my cutting action is 2 1/4. So this fence is placed at 2 1/4, not from the edge of my dado, but to the center line of my dado. And that's an important thing and part of the efficiency of this jig. Instead of marking both walls of all of my dados, I can mark my center line, line up my jig, and be done with it and know it's exactly what I want it to be. As I said earlier, I always tend to put a shoulder on the positive parts of my dados. So this groove, this dado, is 1/2 inch. My final pieces are 3/4 inch, meaning that there's going to be a 1/8 inch shoulder on either side. Now comes the tricky part. My dado is cut exactly where it needs to be, and if I were to remove this jig and set up a secondary fence to insert my dominoes exactly in the center of that dado, it would take a little time to make sure that it's square, that it's centered, that it's perfect. I would take a test cut, make sure that it works. So, in order to eliminate that step and all of that time wasted, we're going to use this same jig without moving anything to cut our dominoes. Now, what that looks like in practice is this. I need to create a secondary fence that lessens the gap between my fence and the center line of my dado to the distance between the plate on the domino and the center line on the domino. Now, this distance is 10 millimeters. And as I said earlier, the distance between my router fence and the center of my dado is 2 1/4. So we're flip-flopping between metric and imperial, which is less than ideal, but it is what it is, and we can figure that out. I know I need a gap of 10 mil from the base of my plate to the center line of my domino, and I need to subtract that from 2 1/4. So let's figure out that math and make that cut. Everything looks good, everything feels good. Those dominoes look dead centered in our dado, but there's only one way to find out if they actually are, and that's to test fit it. Now this is the piece I already cut. We've got some dominoes, so I'm gonna slide these right in here. I'm gonna pop this in. I haven't dry fit this yet, so this is gonna be a live find out if it's wrong. I'm actually gonna pop these in here, because it'll be a little bit easier to get the alignment right then. So let's try this again. I'm gonna take this, I'm gonna slide it right onto my dominoes. Look at that. Perfect, perfect. Now, this is how you know you have an accurate jig. If you can take the same pieces and interchange them back and forth, there's no discrepancy from one to another, that's how you know your jig is right. So, good news is, our jig is perfect. Now the question you may have is, okay, that's great, but Eric, how do you cut the positive section? Well, I'm so glad you asked. Let's talk about that. So cutting the positive for this is super, super simple. First and foremost, this piece is 6 inches wide. So just to make life easy, I've placed my dominoes 1.5 inches in from either end. And you can see, maybe you can see, I have some very faint pencil lines on here that I just aligned my domino up to. So I know that it's 1.5 inches in from both ends, meaning that I can mark my piece 1.5 inches in to give me a center line for my domino. Once those are marked and my domino is set to be centered on the thickness of my material, then I can go ahead and plunge my dominoes. And once those are cut, I can cut my shoulders. Now, as I said at the very beginning of this video, dados don't have to be very deep. I usually make my dados 1/8 inch deep. And conveniently, I don't know if you know this, a table saw blade is 1/8 inch wide. Meaning that I can cut the shoulders of my tenon on the table saw blade in a single pass as long as I set the height of the blade correctly. And then I should have a perfect joint. So let's do that. just like that, got a bomb-proof joint. Super, super simple to cut and rock solid. This thing ain't going nowhere, especially once you glue it up. Even dry fit, that's a legitimately tight fit. So, couple of brief things to address on this joint very, very quickly. Number one, I can hear you asking already, do you need dominoes to actually make this joint? No, you can do this with dowels. There's nothing wrong with using dowels. For those of you who know who James Krenov was, he used this joint with dowels for decades. It's just fine. Honestly, this is just a ripoff of a Krenov joint, if you can even call it that, because Krenov didn't invent it. Somebody else was doing it long before him. So you can do the exact same thing with dowels if you just use an infill on this plate to drill that out. So if that's all you can afford, it's just a router and a drill, you can still make this joint. Secondly, on domino placement. This board is 6 inches wide, so it didn't make sense for me to put 3 dominoes in here. I did 2 at 1.5 inches in from the edge, and that's plenty. If I've got a board that's 12 inches wide, I'm probably gonna add some more. Whether that's 3 or 4, I don't know that it really matters. But the more dominoes you place in this board, the more likely you are on human error to have a misalignment issue. So what you'll notice is I cut the smallest setting on these dominoes so that when I put these together, it's super tight. It's snug as a bug in a rug. But if I was doing this over a board that's say 12 inches or wider, what I would usually do is I would make my first domino super snug at a 0 clearance setting, if you will. And then all of my other dominoes in my negative piece, I would cut at the second setting, which is a little wider. Keep all of the ones up here just at 0 so that it's super, super snug. But that way you have a little bit of play in case your domino is off by just a hair one way or the other. You're not gonna be struggling to drive this home. It's not gonna lose any strength. It's not the end of the world. It's just gonna make your life a little bit easier. Now, thirdly and lastly, I do want to thank Festool for being a sponsor of this video. Now, this is a joint that I've been cutting since 2019, maybe. I've been doing it for a long time, and I would be cutting this joint if Festool was not a part of this video. However, I am of the opinion that the domino is maybe the most important piece of equipment to come to market for the woodworking community in the last 20 to 30 years. It is, and this is completely true of my opinion, the tool that allows small independent furniture shops like myself to create at a pace and a scale that is able to rival the bigger shops that have more expensive equipment. That's my opinion, and I'm sticking to it. But regardless, thank you, Festool, for sponsoring this channel and this video. I appreciate your constant support, and I appreciate y'all's constant support as well. So, friends, that's that. I hope this was helpful. I hope it was interesting and informative, and I don't normally make plans, but if this is a thing that you would want me to make plans for so that you can take this and adapt it to whatever settings that you have on your tools, drop a comment below so I can know to do that, and maybe we can figure something out. But in the meantime, the reason I made this jig is so that I can use it on a current project, so I'm gonna get to doing that. And friends, I hope you get out in the shop this week and go make a thing. And, as always, until next week, cheers.